Yep, I gotta finish up the last part of the book for the day. I would have been finished, but we had some electronic difficulties. Um, okay. All right. Oh wait, which ear is this? Okay. All right. So we are on day 5 of the ongoing teaching at Say Their Name Square. For anybody who is not privy to what it is that we're doing out here, I'm going to go through a rundown for you. So on day 1, we read The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Era of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. We read through these things, and while reading through these things, we cross-referenced them with issues that we're facing in Rockford, Illinois, and issues that we're facing as a nation in 2021. And we looked at the problems that she's presented, and we tried to figure out ways that we can learn from the things that she's presenting, and also figure out how some of these issues look in the city of Rockford, Illinois, and what does addressing those issues look like, and how do we start to try to get some reform from those issues. Secondly, the second day we read The End of Policing, and then we compared what issues that were in the end of policing and mentioned in here, and what connections they have with the new Jim Crow, and then what connections they have to where we are standing at as a community right now in Rockford, Illinois. Then we read They Can't Kill Us All by Wesley Lowry. Then the next day we read Asada, an autobiography. And each time, again, with each one of these things, we're reading them, having group discussions at 5 o'clock, depending on who the person reading is. They're taking time in the midst of reading and explaining some of the thought patterns and some of the things that are coming to their consciousness and to their mind as they are reading through these things, and explaining how we can take the issues that are presented in these pieces of literature, and how we can use that information and use that education to work towards black liberation. And so today we are reading Locking Up Our Own. And in this last hour that we have left in Monday, April 5th, we are going to read the epilogue for Locking Up Our Own, and then I'll do a little summarization, and then we will begin with Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police force. Okay, so again, the overall theme for this week is mass incarceration and police terrorism. For people who may be wondering, we've switched sets again. This set is a little familiar to. It's still in a similar area. We in front of City Hall. We just off to the side a little bit differently. And I want people to take note of that picture back there, Denzel Duvant, and take note of what he looks like. Take note of the assault that's taking place at his hands, and I want you to remember his face. And I want you, as you listen to these things and as you listen to us read this literature, I want you to be able to visualize the things that took place to this young man, not in 1990 or 1980 or in 1960, but here in 2021 in Rockford, Illinois, these things happen. So as we get ready to finish up James Forman Jr.'s Locking Up Our Own, we're on the epilogue. For anyone who may be reading alone or keeping up, we're on page 217 of Locking Up Our Own. Again, we're going to go through these things, read them, and then we're going to then we have conversations in the midst about how these things are related to the issues that we're facing as a community today. Epilogue: The Reach of Our Mercy. Oh yeah, broke off of here, fell and broke. After 40 years of increasingly punitive criminal justice policies, D.C. finally took a significant step in the other direction. In 2013 and 2014, the city council once again debated a proposal to decriminalize possession of small amounts of marijuana. Back in 1975, as we have seen, D.C. council member David Clark had introduced decriminalization legislation only to see the effort die in the face of fierce resistance from his fellow council member, the black nationalist pastor Doug Moore. In 2013, council member Tommy Wales took up the cause. Like Clark, Wales sought to replace criminal penalties for possession of small amounts of marijuana with the modest civil fine. In essence, marijuana possession would be treated like a parking violation. Though the two proposals were similar, the outcomes were not. Decriminalization failed in 1975, but passed overwhelmingly in 2014. What changed? In 1975, D.C. and the rest of Black America was still reeling from the heroin epidemic and the unprecedented crime rates of the late 1960s. By 2014, on the other hand, America was well into what the criminologist Franklin Zimring has called the Great American Crime Decline. Shootings were still too common, especially in the nation's poorest African American communities, but the trend lines were unmistakable. In 2012, D.C. saw 88 homicides, the lowest number since 1961, and a stunning decrease from the 485 killings that devastated the city in 1991, during the worst of the crack crisis. Drug-related killings have fallen 83% between 2000 and 2014. D.C.'s crime decline reflected an American trend. The national murder rate in 2014 was lower than it had been in 1960. Black Americans benefit the most when violent crime drops. Since 90% of D.C.'s murder victims are black, the city's homicide decline overwhelmingly saved black lives, almost 400 in a single year. The same story can be told in other cities. In New York, for example, the crime decline of the last 2 decades means that almost 1,500 fewer people were killed each year than what would have died had murder rates remained at the level of the 1990s. Almost 2/3 of the lives saved, 1,000 lives a year, were of black and Hispanic men between the ages of 15 and 44. Just as there is no consensus as to why crime rates rose in the 1960s, there is no agreement as to why they fell during the past 2 decades. The tough on crime movement deserves some of the credit, although criminologists do not see it as the most important factor. They point to other causes, including an aging population, the end of the crack epidemic and its violent markets, and a decrease in lead exposure among children. Childhood lead exposure has been linked to increased criminality. If the crime decline gave black officials the opportunity to consider less punitive alternatives, the war on crime's cumulative impact on black America turned the opportunity into an imperative. According to the most recent data, African Americans are held in state prisons at a rate 5 times that of whites. In 11 states, at least 1 in 20 adult black men is in prison. I want people to think about what that stat means. Think about what that concept means. Think about what it means when we give out some of these statistics. African Americans are held in state prisons at a rate 5 times that of whites. In 11 states, at least 1 in 20 adult black men is in prison. That is something that is systematically being done. That is something that is purposefully being done. We cannot afford to pretend like these things are happening out of happenstance or out of coincidence or out of some type of irony. When there's literature and documents and essays and books of people telling us that these things have been systematically done to specific communities. And so as we get to the epilogue and to the end of this book, it's important for us to understand the dramatic impact that mass incarceration has had on communities of color. The dramatic increase in criminal convictions has undermined an already depressed labor market. Jobs, never easy to find in the ghetto, have virtually disappeared for those with criminal convictions. As the sociologist Becky Priddick concludes, by 2008, a young black man without a high school diploma was more likely to be in prison or jail than to be employed in the paid labor force. In addition to such general trends, the 2014 D.C. Council could see something more specific. The harm inflicted by marijuana criminalization had increased far beyond anything the 1975 Council could have imagined. Racial disparities in marijuana arrests existed even in the 1970s, but because of the war on drugs was just beginning, their catastrophic impact on black communities wasn't yet apparent. As a result, someone like Councilmember Doug Moore could credibly argue in 1975 that marijuana use posed a greater threat to the city's black youth than the laws prohibiting it. By 2014, this view found adherents. 4 decades into the war on marijuana, the rising arrest rates and increasing racial disparities were clearly the greater evil. And so what we need to understand, what is being pointed out there, is that it was a point in time where politicians were trying to figure out what would be the greater harm, allowing weed to be decriminalized and then become more normalized in communities and have to deal with what they deem to be negative impacts of marijuana being smoked by young black people in communities, or they had to figure out if giving these young men criminal records, if shipping these young men in and out of jails over weed was going to be more detrimental to the community, and they chose to believe that. That they chose to believe that decriminalizing weed would be the more detrimental thing, and that has proven to be false. The more detrimental thing has been these young black and brown boys who have been paraded through this mass incarceration system, who have been paraded through this institution, and who it is now legal to discriminate against them because of arrest records. It's legal to discriminate against them because of open cases that they have. Not even just convictions, just because of arrest and open cases. And so we have to understand that this is one of the reasons why we have to get rid of the mass incarceration system as we know it, because it extends further beyond just being inside of prison cells or inside of jail cells. When people are released out of those jail cells, they do not have the equal opportunity as everybody else in the society to make ends meet and to have jobs. They're limited and depending on what states they live in, what areas they can live in. If they can have link cards, they're limited in the opportunities that they can get when it comes to employment. And so we have to understand that we have to not only destigmatize people being arrested and destigmatize people having criminal records, but we have to erase this system as a whole, or we will continue to be stuck in this same perpetuating cycle. Okay, so right now we're on page 219 of the epilogue. Not only have many more black citizens been arrested for marijuana possession by 2014, but each arrest carried greater consequences. Technological changes meant that by 2014, records of convictions and even arrests were much easier for third parties to obtain than they had been in 1975. Meanwhile, new laws meant that employers, schools, housing agencies, and others could, and in some cases were required to, use that information against drug offenders. Each of these changes was destructive enough individually, but their cumulative impact on the black community was devastating. Warrior and pretext policing led to more arrests, technological changes made the arrest impossible to escape, and legal changes turned a single arrest into a lifetime of exclusion and subordination. And so that is what we were just speaking about right there, laid out in more articulate terms. And it talks about the cycle of mass incarceration. And that's why we have to get to a place of we have to use things like the vindicated five or the exonerated five from the young folks who were wrongfully convicted of what happened in Central Park in New York in I believe it was the 80s or the 90s. We have to use those things as overall as sort of cataclysms or as microcosms of the issues, but then we have to look deeper and think about all the people who deal with more microaggression or smaller versions of those things, and then we have to think about how those cycles perpetuate. If we only think about one single individual act in the cycle and we do not think about the cycle as a whole and how it feeds itself and perpetuates, we will never be able to break the cycle. So when we think about people, when they say things to you like repeat offenders, when people go in and out of jail and in and out of the system, it's because when they are released out of jail and released out of the system, things are set up in a manner for them to go back into those systems. And so right here when it says warrior and pretext policing led to more arrests, which is something that we've already read about in multiple books and we'll read about again in The Rise of the Warrior Police. But pretext policing led to more arrests, technological changes made the arrest impossible to escape, and legal changes turned a single arrest into a lifetime of exclusion and subordination. Just as important to the reform effort was the fact that by 2014, advocates for decriminalization had discovered potent language to describe the drug war's devastation of black communities. Marijuana criminalization was no longer simply a bad idea with racially disparate results, as decriminalization proponents had suggested in 1975. Rather, criminalization constituted, as one witness explained during a city council hearing, a war on the district's black neighborhoods and black residents. The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander played a crucial role in providing advocates with the framework for understanding and a rhetoric for criticizing the war on drugs. Published in 2010, the book quickly became required reading for anyone concerned about mass incarceration. Alexander's ideas profoundly influenced the D.C. Council's marijuana debates, with various witnesses citing the new Jim Crow and one council member explaining that the book had compelled me to be heavily engaged in this conversation. The documented harm caused by decades of marijuana criminalization, plus powerful new arguments rooted in a commitment to racial justice, proved a winning combination for decriminalization proponents. In 1975, polls indicated that only 39% of black voters supported legalization, while 51% opposed it. By 2014, a solid 58% of the city's black residents supported marijuana decriminalization. Even the city's black churches switched sides. In 1975, black ministers had helped defeat the criminalization, arguing that marijuana was a gateway to heroin. By 2014, the ministers had concluded that marijuana was instead a gateway to the criminal justice system. Okay, and so again, we want to be doing cross references, and we want to be we don't want to just be reading these things just to say that we read another book. We don't want to just be reading these passages to say that we read the passages. We want to be reading these things and then incorporating these things into our thought pattern, and then further along incorporating these things into our actions. And that is going to be the way that we can form the type of ideology that will liberate us as a people. And so I think it's important, again, that we pull ourselves out of the book sometimes, and we digest what it is that we read, and we digest the context that it has. And so, and again, we have purposefully tried to pick out. Using the word curriculum may not be the proper nomenclature, but we purposely try to pick out a curriculum in which people could read these things and get an understanding, and people could read these things and they could connect to each other and feed off of each other. So that way you weren't reading something on day one, then reading something on day two when they have no type of connection, and it feels like you're learning something brand new all over again. Then reading something on day three, then reading something on day four, and each time feeling like you're reading all of these things over and over, reading all of these brand new ideas and these brand new concepts, and it's just too much to wrap your mind around. We don't want you to feel like you're taking 8 different courses about 8 different things. We want to make these things as digestible and understandable and comprehensible and retainable as possible. So it's important that each book sort of supports the next book or the previous book. So here in Locking Up Our Own, he references Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow and says that people reading The New Jim Crow had their minds changed. People reading The New Jim Crow came and used The New Jim Crow and used excerpts from it to speak truth to power as to why they should be decriminalizing marijuana. So that right there lets you know the power of literature. That right there lets you know the power of words. That this book that this black woman wrote helped to change from 1975 to 2014. Of course, it was multiple other things that were pivotal and instrumental in these changes happening, but that book was something that was noted specifically. And as is one of the things that people have said is that book is the Bible for the new movement that's going on in not in Rockford, but in the nation around ending mass incarceration. So I want people to understand that is why we led with the new Jim Crow. So you read this, Locking Up Our Own, and then it goes and it references the new Jim Crow. When you read The End of Policing, towards in the war on drugs portion of The End of Policing, it references the new Jim Crow. When you read through They Can't Kill Us All, it speaks about the militarization of the police in Ferguson, and that's going to incorporate into the rise of the warrior cop, the militarization of America's police forces. And then the rise of the warrior cop incorporates just into what we just read in here when it talks about warrior cop mentality and pretext stops led to more black and brown communities being ran in and out of the criminal justice system. So that right there connects all 5 of these books, intertwining them with each other. And And then this autobiography of Assata, a black woman who was inserted and dealt with each of these things on a personal level, dealt with each of these concepts on a personal level. It lets you know what happens when you try to revolt against this system, when you try to revolt against this society. Assata is the example of what happens when you try to do those things. And so we have to learn from Assata, and in the midst of learning from Assata, we have to learn from James Forman Jr. and locking up our own. We have to learn from Radley Balco and Rise of the Warrior Cop. We have to learn from Wesley Lowry and They Can't Kill Us All. We have to learn from Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow. We have to learn from Alex Vitale in The End of Policing. And then we have to combine all of those things, put them all together like a gumbo pot, and then that is going to be how we forge the type of ideology that will liberate our brothers and sisters. But if we continue to just sit at home and do things the same way that we've done them for years and years down the line, nothing will change, and we'll be stuck in this cycle forever. Okay, so let's see where we at. Okay. Marijuana decriminalization is an important victory. Sandra Dozier, who lost her job at FedEx when she was arrested with $20 worth of marijuana in her glove compartment, can attest to why it matters. So can thousands of others. But the victory is also a cautionary tale about the limits of recent criminal justice reform efforts. First, as a percentage of our nation's incarcerated population, those possessing small amounts of marijuana barely register. For every 10,000 people behind bars in America, only 6 are there because of marijuana possession. A greater concern is that criminal justice reformers increasingly separate nonviolent drug offenders, including those convicted of marijuana possession, from violent criminals. In this view, nonviolent drug offenders are worthy of compassion and a chance to redeem themselves. Violent offenders, by contrast, deserve what they get. During his second term, President Barack Obama became the most prominent proponent of what we might call the nonviolent offenders-only approach to criminal justice reform. In 2015, Obama outlined his final criminal justice reform agenda in a widely anticipated speech to the NAACP's annual convention. He divided the world of criminal defendants into 2 groups. First, there are the nonviolent drug offenders, whose incarceration, the president said, is the real reason our prison population is so high. Obama argued that the current system punishes these offenders too severely. If you're a low-level drug dealer or you violate your parole, you owe some debt to society, but you don't owe 20 years. You don't owe a life sentence. Obama contrasted the nonviolent offenders with another group, violent criminals who, he said, need to be in jail. Who are these people? Murderers, predators, rapists, gang leaders, drug kingpins. We need some of those folks behind bars. In a press conference the next day, explaining why his effort to reduce mandatory minimum sentences was limited to nonviolent drug offenses, Obama remarked, "I tend not to have a lot of sympathy when it comes to violent crime." Obama's okay, and then I want to interject here. I was gonna try to just remember it for the day of, but it's too much stuff. It's too many things that we got and too many moving pieces. We need to take advantage of every opportunity and every moment. So I want to point out that our day 7 book is going to be Until We Reckon: Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair by Danielle Sered. And this book is specifically about violent offenders. I'm going to read you an excerpt to the introduction. Although over half the people incarcerated in America today have committed violent offenses, the focus of reform has been almost entirely on nonviolent and drug offenses. Danielle Sered's brilliant and groundbreaking Until We Reckon steers directly and unapologetically into the question of violence, offering approaches that will help end mass incarceration and increase safety. Widely recognized as one of the leading proponents of a restorative approach to violent crime, Sered asks us to reconsider the purposes of incarceration and argues persuasively that the needs of survivors of violent crime and their communities are better met by asking people who commit violence to take responsibility for their actions and make amends in ways that are meaningful to those that they have hurt, none of which happens in the context of a criminal trial or a prison sentence. Sered launched and directs Common Justice, one of the few organizations offering alternatives to incarceration for people who commit serious violent crime, and which has produced immensely promising results. Critically, Surratt argues that the reckoning owed is not only on the part of those who have committed violence, but also by our nation for its over-reliance on incarceration to produce safety at great cost to communities, survivors, racial equity, and the very fabric of our democracy. So right here in the end of Locking Up Our Own, they're speaking about how Obama is basically denouncing any type of adjustment to the system when it comes to violent crime and violent offenders. And so that links these two books together. That links this 5th day to the 7th day. That links us to Until We Reckon. So as we go through here and reread about this, Obama distancing reform from violent criminals, I want you to understand that we will also address that coming forward in the future. Obama's choice to limit criminal justice reform to low-level, nonviolent drug offenders is a common one among elected officials, including African-American elected officials. At the federal level, black members of the House of Representatives rallied around the Sentencing Reform Act of 2015, whose stated goal was to reduce mandatory minimums for certain low-level drug offenders while ensuring that serious violent felons do not get out early. At the state and local level, African-American prosecutors such as California's Kamala Harris, Baltimore's Marilyn Mosby, and Philadelphia's Seth Williams all built reform agendas around nonviolent criminals. Defenders of the nonviolent offenders-only approach to reform are sometimes silent about who is being left out. Other times they enlist violent offenders as boogeymen, suggesting that leniency for nonviolent offenders will create space to lock up the violent ones for longer. As Representative Marsha Fudge, Democrat from Ohio, said, our current system severely punishes nonviolent offenders while granting violent criminals freedom and unfettered opportunities to menace our communities. The nonviolent offenders only perspective is understandable and broadly popular. I might have shared it too once until I met Dante. Dante Highsmith was clear. I want to go home, he said. He had just turned 16, and we were sitting in the legal visiting room at Oak Hills, D.C.'s juvenile prison. Light-skinned, with hazel eyes and dreadlocks, Dante seemed small for his age, especially now that he was swallowed up by an oversized prison-issue sweatshirt. I had asked Dante what he wanted to happen in this case. It was a simple question, but one that is rarely posed to young people in his shoes. As a senior lawyer had preached to me and the other new attorneys during our orientation to juvenile court, everybody with power talks at our clients, but nobody listens to them. At the public defender service, we listen. I was listening closely, but I wasn't sure how to respond to Dante's request. Going home was a long shot. He was charged with armed robbery and evidence against him was strong. According to police reports, shortly after 9 p.m. on an unusually frigid January night, a man was waiting for a bus on 14th Street Northwest in D.C.'s Columbia Heights neighborhood. He was approached by a teenage male wearing a black jacket. The teenager said, Give it up, man. Give it up or I'll cut you." The man looked at the teen and saw a bulge in his pocket. Thinking it must be a knife or worse, a gun, the man reached into his front pocket, threw out what he had and ran. The robber scooped up the bills, jammed them into the pocket of his jeans, and ran the other way. He didn't get far. A woman leaving a grocery store across the street had seen what was happening. She started yelling. A security guard working in the same store gave chase, and the security guard was fast. He caught the fleeing teenager a couple of blocks later and held him for the police, who had already been called by other shoppers. When the police came and searched the teen, they found a knife and $12 in his pocket. The police asked the suspect for his name, and he told them, Dante Highsmith. At the police station that night, Dante signed a brief confession. It was written in his own handwriting and contained the important details of the crime. At the bottom of one-page confession, just above Dante's signature, he had written, "I'm sorry." The case looked even worse once I met with the prosecutor. The legal term for our meeting was a discovery conference, at which the prosecutor was supposed to provide police reports and other material outlining the government's evidence. Well, with Lynn Leslie, an African-American woman who had been... My fault, I gotta get something to drink, y'all. Hold up. But with Lynn Leslie, an African-American woman who had been prosecuting juveniles for almost a decade, the discovery conferences often devolved into impromptu lectures, especially with newer public defenders like me. I had been practicing for just over half a year, and Leslie seemed to delight in holding forth about the menace of crime in an effort to puncture my bubble of innocence. Dante's case, I was about to learn, would provide perfect fodder for one of her harangues. Leslie explained that the victim was a middle-aged African-American man, a laborer on his way home from work. I would later learn that his name was Jeremy Thomas, though Leslie, like many prosecutors, referred to him as my victim. Damn, he ran that light. After describing the evidence, she said, her eyes narrowing, "Look, Forman, my victim doesn't have it easy, but he is breaking his back every day, hauling boxes, doing the right thing, providing for his family. And this is what he gets?" I could see where this was going. The criminal justice system isn't supposed to distinguish among victims. Everybody is guaranteed the law's equal protection. And the punishment shouldn't change depending on whether the victim is rich or poor, black or white, a nice guy or a jerk. That's the theory, anyway. In reality, all that does matter. In many courthouses across America, a working-class black man like Mr. Thomas might have his case overlooked. But he stood a better chance in D.C.'s majority black courthouse, especially if he had the good fortune of having his case land on the desk of the right prosecutor. To have his case taken seriously, Mr. Thomas couldn't have done better than Lynn Leslie. She was part of a breed of race-conscious black prosecutors who prided the system to value the lives of black victims. She was a reminder that all my claims about punitive criminal justice being a civil rights issue, other black Americans believe just as passionately that rampant crime and violence remain the defining racial justice questions of the day. As she lectured me in her office, I could already hear in her court, "Your Honor," she would say, full of righteous fury, "nobody deserves to be accosted by some young punk. Nobody deserves to be robbed, and nobody deserves to live in fear. But let me tell you, Mr. Thomas deserves it least of all." I feared it would work, especially before certain judges. Well for it, y'all. And here was the biggest obstacle Dante and I faced: the judge. Dante's case was before Judge Curtis Walker, the same judge who had invoked Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. en route to locking up my client Brandon. I couldn't see how Dante would make out any better than Brandon had. Sure, Brandon had a gun, which was more serious than Dante's knife, but Brandon hadn't actually used it. Dante, on the other hand, had robbed somebody. Just as easily as I could hear Prosecutor Leslie advocating for Dante to go to prison, I could hear Judge Walker agreeing. "Son," he would say forcefully, looking down at Dante, "Martin Luther King Jr. didn't give his life so that you could be walking around with a knife, holding up hard-working people." None of it looked good. Dante faced strong evidence, a determined prosecutor, and a passionate judge. Now, if this had been a movie, I would proceed to find an overlooked witness who confessed to the crime and reveal that Dante had been framed, or would file a brilliant legal motion that upended the government's case. But in the miracle-free world of the public defender, a case like Dante's required me to act like a social worker. Dante would almost certainly plead guilty, and his future would depend on the sentencing hearing. I would need to persuade the judge that something other than prison was the best outcome for him, the community, and the interest of justice. And that's where the social work came in. To do a good job at sentencing meant that I needed to look deeply into Dante's background, trying to find moments in which he had been failed by his family, schools, or other institutions of society in general. Dang, long epilogue. Yeah, 12. Yeah, we're going to do this epilogue to 12, and then it's going to be a wrap. It's a little chilly. Okay, my fault, y'all. I'm just thinking out loud. That's it. Police took my blankets in the middle of the night like cowards. Anyways, I'm having my own little bit. As I dug into Dante's background, I found a lot to work with, beginning with the trauma of his early years. Dante hadn't been arrested before, so he didn't have a juvenile case history. Nevertheless, when I went to the office that kept the child welfare files, the clerk handed me a monstrously thick binder. Opening it revealed page after page of pain. Dante had a younger brother, Jason, and the two boys had been removed from their mother's custody when Dante was 8 and Jason was 5. One night shortly before the removal, a caseworker had stopped by the home at 10 p.m. and found Jason and Dante sitting on their front stoop, unattended. According to the boys, this wasn't unusual. They said their mother sometimes told them to wait outside while she spent time with mommy's friends. Their mother, Jacinda, would later admit to a caseworker that she was addicted to crack and that she occasionally left the boys outside when she was using with friends or, a few times, when she slept with men who gave her drugs. School documents also told a disheartening story. Dante was smart, his teacher said, but his behavior stood in the way of his learning. His educational record showed a consistent pattern of minor misconduct, a scuffle with the student here, mouthing off to a teacher there, nothing too serious, but also not a trajectory towards educational success. The problems had started in elementary school. His first suspension was for 2 days in second grade when he pushed another student. According to Dante, the student had called his mother a whore. Despite the warning signs, Dante had never received counseling or other services over the years. The school's only response was to suspend him for increasingly long periods. Now, by high school, Dante had been held back twice and appeared on the cusp of dropping out. There were a few bright spots. When Dante and Jason were taken from their mother, they were placed with their grandmother, Jacinda's mother, instead of being sent into foster care system. Jacinda's mother was often sick and couldn't manage teenage boys as well as she would have liked, but she was caring, drug-free, and fiercely protective of her grandsons. As for school, Dante was a star in his carpentry and woodshop class, and a visit to his and Jason's bedroom revealed the fruits of his labor. Carvings and other half-finished projects were crammed into every corner. The piece de resistance was a slab of wood almost 5 feet high, forming the letters Jason carved across the top. Dante had given it to his little brother for his 13th birthday. I could see how much Jason adored his older brother when he showed me the carving, saying it was my best birthday present ever. Until this arrest, Dante had avoided the criminal justice system. So why now? Why this night? Why this robbery? The first few times we met, I avoided talking to him about the crime itself. But once we had developed more of a relationship and I thought he trusted me, I asked him about it. His story was one I had heard before, and it rang true. A group of guys who lived on Dante's block and the two adjoining ones called themselves the 13th Street Mob. Though, like many names for neighborhood crews in D.C., theirs was preposterously ambitious. The mob was about 10 guys, and though 13th Street stretched for miles, they all came from a 3-block stretch. However, if you were a teenager living on one of those blocks, they were in charge, and you crossed them at your own peril. Dante found this out himself when he was 12 and his grandmother sent him to the grocery store for a box of cereal. He had the bad fortune of running into 3 members of the crew on his way out of the store. They were older than he was and bigger, and they demanded the cereal. He had no choice but to give it to them. He returned home to his grandmother empty-handed and in tears. Now that Dante was about to turn 16 himself, he was given a chance to join the gang. He told me that he had been on the fence, standing around on the corner with the guys seemed like a waste of time, but he liked the sense of camaraderie and the protection. It's just easier if you know somebody has your back, he explained. The other members of the crew told him what he had to do. Rob somebody at the bus stop and bring the money back to the group who would be waiting in the alley behind the corner store. So that's what he did, or tried to do. Okay, we coming to the end of this. This was the epilogue. I just wanted to go through and read this. The epilogue, we're not going to get through it. It's 10 more pages. It's 11:52. So what I want to do is try to do a little summarization of the book. He's going to get into the violent offenders. That's maybe something that when we read about the book about violent offenders, maybe we go back and revisit that, especially since I read this part by myself, and I'm sure that we'll have that group discussion about that other book with multiple people, so I can go back and reference that. But we excuse me. I think that as we come to the close of this day, and as we come to the close of the 5th day, and we've been doing this here for 5 days, I think that we are at a point now where a picture is really starting to be painted broadly. and you can start to see how these things really affect Rockford, Illinois. And you can see how these things truly have connotations to the existence that we are having right here, right now in Rockford, Illinois. And so I just wanted to, I just want everybody who has been watching for these last 5 days, whether you've watched for 5 seconds, for 5 minutes, for 5 hours, or for all 5 days, thank you. Anybody who has came out and participated and read, came out and participated and listened, came out and participated by helping with the passing out of food or helping with serving food, we want to thank you. Anybody who has donated any type of money to help us get the equipment to get these streams up and running, we want to thank you. Anybody who has dropped off any food or any water in these 5 days since April has been going on and we've been doing this teaching, we want to thank you. And we want to let people know that we want to keep this same energy going all the way through the rest of this month. We just want to continuously uptick it. We're going to continuously keep reading, and by the time we get to this month, we will have close to 23 plus books, multiple pieces of literature about things, multiple pieces of news stories and journalism, and case text about cases here, specifically in Rockford, Illinois. And so what we are doing right now is we are building that we are building up the argument for revolution. We are building up the argument that says reform is not enough. We are building up the argument that says just adjusting the way that this society runs is not enough. We are building up the argument that says we must change this entire system, that we need a revolution not only of legislation and a revolution of policies, but we need a revolution of consciousness in this society. We need a revolution of this society as a whole. And so I want anybody that's out there to go back to the May 30th Alliance Facebook page and watch all the videos from the past 5 days of us reading these books. I want people to go out and purchase the books that we are reading. I want people who have the means to purchase multiple copies of these books and bring them down here. We are building the May 30th Alliance Community Library. We're going to continue to read these books. By the time, once we get to the end of April, if we only have one copy of each book, we will then start lending out those one copies. But for right now, any book we have one copy of, we're going to hold on until we get to the end of April. But we want the community, people in the community, to purchase books about police terrorism and mass incarceration, purchase books about racial injustice, purchase books about demonstrating and organizing and protesting and mobilizing, and about the history of this nation and the history of this city and the history of this state. So that way we can have honest dialogues about these things, and we can figure out ways that we can adequately address these things and rid ourselves of these evils. And so, again, I'm just going to do one more rundown, one more reminder. We want to continuously say, speak the names of these pieces of literature that are that we are using out here. Excuse me, sorry about that. Again, the first day, the new Jim Crow. Second day, the end of policing. Third day, they can't kill us all. Fourth day, Asada. Fifth day, locking up our own. And now tomorrow, which is, wait a minute, what time is it? Tomorrow, which is in 4 minutes, we will begin reading Rise of the Warrior Cop, the militarization of America's police forces. We may not start that exactly at midnight. We got some things going on with electronics needing to be charged, but we will be back. We will be back. All right, man. Day 5, that's a wrap. Oh, damn. Finish.